In Scripture, as in our lives, the wilderness is this deeply ambiguous place. It's more than one thing at once. The wilderness is this place of freedom and possibility and beauty, and it's also a place of danger and loneliness, and a place where there's uncertainty. The rules of normal life are suspended in the wilderness. The rules of the city are suspended. And that can be marvelously freeing, or it can be destabilizing. Sometimes we're in the wilderness in a t-shirt and it is perfect. And sometimes it's too hot, or too cold, or too rainy, or these days too on fire. In the wilderness, you can sing as loud as you want, and only the birds will complain. You can dance like no one is watching, because no one is watching. Although if you fall and hurt yourself while you are dancing, while no one is watching, it may be a while before an ambulance comes. It may never come. Maybe you've had the experience of being in the backcountry and walking on a path and realizing there was no railing beside you. And suddenly you could possibly fall off of that path and fall, a great distance indeed, maybe to big injury or even death. What is that feeling like, realizing you're now in a place without railings? It's exciting, maybe, and there's also something going on in your stomach at the same time. I don't know if I want to be here. These days, we almost always are in the wilderness because we've chosen to be in the wilderness. It's very rare today to end up in the wilderness by accident. So generally speaking, you're in the wilderness because you've chosen to go hiking, or you've chosen to go canoeing or skiing or camping or something else. To end up in the wilderness by accident, to end up sort of finding that you've been pushed there. This is, something that may never happen in your life, or may only happen once in your life. This is the stuff of car accidents and plane crashes, of 3-hour tours. In Scripture, by contrast, hardly anyone ever chooses to go to the wilderness. I don't think there's a story anywhere in Scripture that begins as she was going for a hike, comma. It's just not how stories in Scripture start. Just about everyone in Scripture is pushed into the wilderness. It's not somewhere they wanted to be, at least not the first time. So Moses and the Israelites are in the wilderness because they're fleeing slavery, and Hagar is in the wilderness because she's been kicked out of her family, right? And Jacob is in the wilderness because he is running away from his brother's wrath. And even though the wilderness is an unchosen place, a dangerous place, it is where people keep on meeting God in Scripture. So it's because they are in the wilderness, it's while they're in the wilderness, that Moses and the Israelites encounter the pillar of fire. It's in the wilderness that Hagar hears the voice from heaven. It is in the wilderness that Jacob wrestles with the stranger in the night. And today, it's in the wilderness that a crowd of people, a big crowd of people, comes sunburned and lost and sick and hungry and searching, and finds Jesus. Today we hear the story that we sometimes call the feeding of the 5,000, or sometimes the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. This is an unusual story insofar as it appears in all 4 Gospels. There aren't many of those, are there? Stories that all 4 evangelists want to tell to us. Only Mark, or Matthew and Luke rather, tell us about Jesus' birth. Only John tells us that water becomes wine. Only Mark, we heard about a storm this morning, but it's only Mark who says that during the storm in the sea, Jesus is taking a nap, right? And he wakes up when the nap happens and says to the storm, "Peace, be still." But all 4 tell us about this feast in the wilderness. And it seems like the Gospels are singing out to us, if you are going to encounter Jesus, if you're going to understand Jesus, you need to encounter this story. You need to understand this story. I mentioned in the grace notes that it's been 504 days since we last celebrated the Eucharist as a community. It's just an unreal thing to say out loud. I didn't ever imagine that I would fast from the Eucharist for more than a year. And that fast feels like a outward and visible sign of so many other losses. 504 is sort of a little bit of an arbitrary date, but it kind of feels like when pandemic began. I mean, maybe we could sort of adjust it by a few days, but it really does feel like it showed up abruptly. I have a friend who says the beginning of pandemic. She's quoting from a novel, and I forget which novel it is. There's a character in the novel, and she says that pandemic was the same thing that he said about getting poor. Someone said to him, when did you become poor? And he said, very slowly and then all at once. And that's kind of how pandemic started, right? In sort of December and January and February, we heard about this thing that was going on overseas and then in Italy, and we thought, like, is this a thing? And then I remember, I think it was a Wednesday, that I heard that there was a parish down the way that was not going to meet on Sunday, and I thought, well, that's completely over the top. And then the next day, we decided we were not going to meet on Sunday. And so many of our beloved practices were changed or put on hiatus. The Friday feast was in a different form and then on hiatus, and the sack lunch ministry was in a different form and then on hiatus, and then the quilters could not meet, and the coffee hour, which is such a key part of who we are, Charles Mickey calls happy hour, didn't happen for over a year. It's all these losses. And of course, it was not unique to our parish, right? Pandemic showed up in the rest of our society. I mean, we use this word pandemic, which means, of course, like an out-of-control illness moving around the world, but I think we actually use it as shorthand for these 504 days. That's what we mean when we talk about pandemic. So when we say pandemic, we mean coronavirus, but we also mean skies that were filled with smoke. We also mean the end of the peaceful transfer of power in our elections. We also mean the Capitol got assaulted. We also mean that there was tear gas in the streets. We also mean that we struggled as a nation with racial justice. We could keep on adding to that list. We also mean that so many of our neighbors were gasping for air, either because they were on a ventilator or because a police officer was kneeling on their neck. This year was this massive shared grief, this massive shared trauma. It was an unchosen wilderness. I reckon the people who come to see Jesus today know something about trauma and something about loss. All of them live under occupation. All of them live with the violence of another nation's army in their country. Most of them, all of them, live with poverty. Many of them are sick. So what quarantine looks like in the pandemics of Jesus' time is getting pushed out into the wilderness. That's where you have to quarantine until you are better. And many of them maybe are here because, like John the Baptist, the wilderness, despite its danger, is the one place where they can tell the truth about who they are. And there's a lot of them who show up. So the text says 5,000. Some of the other gospels say that there's 5,000 plus women and children. So this is a survey that only the head of household has answered. And in this case, it just says there's 5,000. But this was originally an oral story. This was originally told around a campfire before it was written down. And I think when an oral storyteller says 5,000, they were saying something similar to what a child says when he says the fish was this big. What they're saying is there were a lot of people there. It's a huge, huge crowd that shows up. And this crowd is holding this grief and holding this trauma of this unchosen time in the wilderness. And if they're like me, and maybe if they're like you, they come to Jesus and they say, please, Jesus, could you put everything back to normal? Could you put everything back to the way it was before? Because that's a big part of what I want. Could we just turn back the clock to how it was before? I want Frank Schramling to be alive again. I want Jack Cooper, Jenna's dad, to be alive again. I want my friend and boss, Bill Ellis, to be alive again. I want there never to have been smoke in the skies or tear gas in the streets or a mob attacking the Capitol or anyone gasping for breath. Please, put things back to normal. And I guess Jesus, being the Son of God, could do that if he wanted to. He could wave his wand and say, it's all gone. The year that was, the 504 days are all gone. But Jesus doesn't do that. What he does is feed people. There's a feast. So we hear that this scene takes place, this wilderness scene takes place on a flat place with a lot of grass. And grass is wonderful, and it's good for soccer and for sitting down. But unless you're a ruminant, it's not good for eating. And all the people are hungry. And so Jesus has everybody turn out their backpacks. And what lands on the floor as they turn out their backpacks are 5 compressed sandwiches and 2 tins of tuna. And the disciples start to panic and become anxious, and they say, this is really not enough food for all these people. And one of them starts doing the math. He has a calculator out, and he says, I think I could, half my annual salary could go towards this, and we still couldn't feed everyone. But Jesus says, let's have a meal anyway. And they eat. And a huge number of people eat. And there's plenty. Everyone eats. And there's leftovers at the end. There's this abundance. And somehow this eating changes them. Somehow it changes us. Coming to the table where Jesus is and eating with him changes us. So there's a prayer by Dag Hammarskjöld. It's really short, and I love it. And it goes like this: for all that has been, thank you. For all that will be, yes. Now, I love that prayer, and I don't understand it. Because how could you possibly say thank you for these 504 days? And knowing that a season like this is possible, how could you look to the future and say yes? That doesn't make any sense in my head. But sometimes it makes a little bit of sense in my heart or in my gut. Sometimes I'm able to say thank you and say yes in spite of everything. So we come to the feast come to this feast with Jesus, and the trauma and the loss and the griefs remain. Frank is still dead, and Jack is still dead, and Bill is still dead, and the smoke was still in the sky, and the tear gas still in the streets, and our neighbors still gasped for breath. And we hold all of that. And somehow, with Jesus in this unchosen place, in this meal, somehow our grief and loss and trauma is transformed. It doesn't go away, but with God's help, we're able to hold it somehow. I've listed a lot of big griefs, and this maybe feels like a trivial one after all of those, but I think all griefs are real and matter to God. And so I'll name one of our griefs today is, in not so long, I hope, we're going to throw open the doors of our building and go marching back in like the saints. And when that happens, Jean won't be with us. We'll hold that as well. So come, says Jesus. Come in this unchosen wilderness place. There's bread, there's wine, and I am in them. Come, all ye that are hungry, and eat. And as we eat and drink, maybe we will discover that this bread and wine is enough. And somehow, in spite of everything, this bread and wine is all we need.